Hello, I'm Caro Llewellyn, the still fairly freshly minted CEO of the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. The Wheeler Centre is dedicated to supporting the health and vitality of communities by presenting programs and events that enable the storytelling and story making that builds a strong and resilient society. We believe in the power of literature, ideas, and cross-cultural conversation to enrich lives. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this evening's conversation is taking place on unceded sovereign lands. I'm joining you from Melbourne on the lands of the Kulin Nation and pay the greatest respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge the elders of First Nations, communities, and cultures in the United States and elsewhere. It is my great pleasure and honour to be with you this evening for the third in the new Wheeler Centre series, Broadly Speaking, and my first ever event as host. The Broadly Speaking series lets us have conversations and debates unabashedly focusing on women and feminism, and is made possible by the generous support of Christina Campbell-Pretty AM and family. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Neighbourhood Books, who are the official online bookseller for tonight's event. Neighbourhood Books is a newborn, independent, profit-for-purpose bookstore curated to nourish the local community. They are self-described bibliophiles who believe that people and books are two of the world's greatest assets. I couldn't agree more. And I hope straight after tonight's conversation that you will enter neighbourhoodbooks.com in your browser and go for broke buying the books of tonight's guests. Well, I'm thrilled to welcome our visitors tonight, Anne Goldstein and Mary Norris, who join us from their homes in New York City. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caro.
So I'm just going to begin with short bios of you both, and then we're going to start our conversation. So Anne Goldstein graduated from Bennington College, worked at Esquire magazine before becoming the New Yorker magazine's copy editor, where she edited Adam Gopnik, Janet Malcolm, and John Updike, to name just a few. She picked up Italian through an after-hours language class at the New Yorker in 1986 in the hopes that she could read Dante's Divine Comedy, a desire tracing back to her days as a literature major. She is the recipient of the Pen Renato Poggioli and Prize for her translation of the short story collection Journey to the Land of the Flies. In 2008, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to work on the complete works of Primo Levi, a 3-volume behemoth for which she served as editor and one of the stable of distinguished translators. And of course, she's most famous, superstar famous, you could say, for her translations of Elena Ferrante. Mary Norris is the author of Greek to Me, Adventures of the Comma Queen, which describes her story of learning Greek and the wonders of the Greek language. And the New York Times bestseller, Between You and Me, Confessions of a Comma Queen, her account of her years in the New Yorker copy department with Anne. I'd like to say just that Mary's favourite pencil used to be the Dixon, and then here's another word I'm not going to get, the Dixon Ticonderoga. Is that correct, Mary? Ticonderoga. But now she makes do with the Palomino, again, I'm not going to get that right, Palomino Blackwing. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Now, I would like to cast your eyes back to this, which was a gift that you gave me of your pencils when I left New York. So I've kept them. I have been meaning to frame them, and when I move next, they are going in a frame and onto my wall. But thank you.
You're welcome. I didn't part with this one then.
Mary, the Washington Post raved about your book and said it was pure porn for word nerds. And I'd like to take you back to being a word nerd and ask you about the first question that Anne asked you as a young copy editor at the New Yorker. Do you remember what that question was about spelling?
Oh, do you consider yourself a good speller? Trick question.
Oh.
Why is that a trick question?
Because if you say yes, then it shows hubris, that you wouldn't be looking up a word in the dictionary because you thought you already knew how to spell it. So the correct answer is, oh no, I look everything up in the dictionary.
Do you still abide by that, Anne?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually a great it's a good thing for a translator to know as well, or a good rule for a translator to follow.
I'm going to ask you about dictionaries a little bit later because I'm fascinated about your dictionary stories. But I want to ask you first, Anne, about reading Dante in Italian, which you did do after about a year, I think. Did it live up to the expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. You should also ask Mary because she was in that class too. In fact, Mary was kind of the person. I'd always wanted to read Dante in Italian ever since college when I read it in a parallel text translation. And then Mary, this is quite a few years later, Mary came back from one of her, I forget if it was your first trip to Greece or your second. Anyway.
It was my second trip to Greece when
and she came back through Rome.
Stopped in Rome on the way back.
Yeah, and she also got a little bit of an Italian bug.
We decided at that point that we were both interested in studying Italian. Anna had been interested in studying Italian to read Dante for years. I was interested because I'd just been to Rome and I'd had such a good time eating in restaurants and drinking wine. And I knew some people who spoke Italian, some Italians, Roman family, who I met at Columbia in the classics department, and asked them if they would teach us at the New Yorker, give us an Italian class. And that was, I believe, in 1985.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
And I understand that you actually got started on that first translation you did, The Land of the Flies, because artist Saul Steinberg came in with a manuscript that was written in Italian, and he wanted the New Yorker to do a story about it. And you were the only person who felt that you could, and you just decided to give it a crack. Is that right? And then you went on and won the big prize for it.
Saul Steinberg sent the book. It was a book, actually, that had been published by a small press in Italy. He sent it to Bob Gottlieb, who was the editor of the New Yorker at the time. And Bob just wanted he just wanted something nice to say to Saul Steinberg. And so he gave me the book and said, just look through it and, give me something to say, basically. So I read it. It's quite a wonderful book. It's actually, Journey to the Land of the Flies is the title of the book, but the original book was called Chekhov and Sondrio, which is really about Italians and Russian literature. It was kind of an interest. It's a great book. Anyway, I just thought, I'll just try translating it. And it was, I'm sorry. I just thought it was a way of studying. No, but it was a way of studying Italian. I mean, we'd been studying Italian for about 5 years, I think. And I just thought it was a way of understanding the language in a different way. And so that's really how it was really quite accidental. I mean, almost every translator has an accidental origin story.
And then you won the prize for it, the Pen Prize for it.
Pen Prize, yeah. There was that Italian Pen Prize.
Mm-hmm. Not bad for your first, rodeo to win a prize.
Yeah. No, it was an encouragement.
Mary, your journey to Greek also began at the New Yorker, and while your unbridled enthusiasm for ancient Greek was clear, it took a little time to convince your colleagues that it was something that was going to be of benefit to the magazine. But in the end, you did win out, didn't you? And I believe that in the end, the editor was so overwhelmed by your enthusiasm that he helped you get to Columbia. Is that correct?
It is. I started out studying modern Greek so that I could travel in Greece. I think it's only polite to learn a little of the language of the country that you're traveling in. I had a boss at the time named Ed Stringham, who had traveled a lot in Greece and had studied Greek. And he one day, when I said I wanted to go to Greece, he pulled out a book, was called a modern Greek reader for beginners and started translating it. And that's when I realized, oh, I too could study Greek. Well, the New Yorker had this enlightened policy back then where they paid the tuition for an employee who wanted to study something that had to do with her job. And studying any foreign language has to do with English and with copy editing. So it was while I was in Greece that I decided I wanted to study ancient Greek. And when I came home and I applied to Columbia to take beginning classical Greek and submitted the bill, they had paid for my weekly night class at NYU, but the Columbia class in classical Greek was 10 times the cost, so they balked. And I kept a little dossier of things that went through the copy desk. I was working on the copy desk at the time. Words like ophthalmologist and autochthonous, and even pi, the Greek letter pi. I had all this evidence that there was a lot of Greek in the magazine, and so they had to back down and pay for the class after all. And so I took about 6 semesters of ancient Greek at Columbia. It was fun.
Now, Anne, I believe you studied Latin and French, so you weren't a linguistic novice. But what was it about Italian that really gripped you? What was it about Italian that just really made you feel?
I mean, it's just the most beautiful language. I think it was, in a way, the musicality of it, and the fact that it was kind of like the best of Latin and French. It had all the Latin words in it, or many Latin words in it, and it had a little bit of French accent. I mean, French pronunciation. I mean, it isn't really pronounced like French at all, but it has that Romance sound, and it's just incredibly musical. And I think it was a combination of the language itself, and I think that Dante probably had a lot to do with it as well. That I was so interested in Dante.
I can hear a New York subway.
That's me. That's really? The A train. Mary. That's the A train in Rockaway. I'm sorry. I asked them not to run during this hour, but.
Oh, it's a beautiful sound. It's a beautiful sound. So earlier, Mary, you talked about the doubt that you need. You can't be overconfident. You have to have a lot of doubt. So I wanted to ask you both about that, as about being. Having doubt as a copy editor, questioning things, but also as a translator, because I'm assuming that it runs both ways. But could you both talk to that a little bit?
I mean, at least I feel that I have to look up, when I'm translating, I have to look up all the words, even the words I know, because you never know what nuance of a word is going to be useful in the actual in the final version. And doubt is definitely part of. I think doubt is, at least for me, plays a much larger role in translating than it does in copy editing, because, I mean, especially at the New Yorker, I think there were pretty. You had this framework really, in which you. I mean, it's a framework that I think that one could fit into, but then you absorbed, and. So I just, you sort of, a lot of things become automatic. Like, I mean, obvious things like the serial comma or the double L and canceled, and and certain ways of, certain structures, certain ways that sentences are structured. I don't know how to really explain that, but there are definitely rules that you could follow that in translating are not quite as. I mean, there are rules, obviously, because there are words, but I'm sorry. I think I'm getting myself into a real tangle here.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But I mean, it's so easy to have second thoughts when you're, second thoughts when you're translating, and third thoughts, and to look at something that you've translated, and to say, oh, well, maybe I should have done it that way, which I didn't ever feel quite as much as a copy editor, maybe because it wasn't I wasn't the person who wrote it, but it was easier to pronounce on somebody else's writing I mean, of course, as a translator, it's not your own writing, but it is your own writing. I mean, the translation is your own writing. And it's easy to have doubts about it. I mean, in Italian, for example, when people have questions, I mean, really, there's a word for questions, domanda, but the word that people more often use is dubio, doubt. I have some dubi. I have some doubts. I have some questions.
That would be an easy one. Mary, what about for you?
Well, for me, it was, I learned to copy edit from geniuses at the New Yorker. And from that, I learned that I was not a genius. And to have too much confidence, because I won a spelling bee in 6th grade did not mean I was a good speller. What I learned to do was to admit that I might have missed something and go over a thing a second time, always. Even though, I might not like the piece so much. I might think, well, I was really awake for that. I don't need to go over it a second time. Whenever I went over it, I was always glad because, I was willing to see if I'd missed something. And I always found lots of things that I had missed. And if I didn't have that self-doubt, that the doobie, the worry that I had missed something, I wouldn't look at it again and I would miss things and I would not have worked out in that job at all. So.
How intimidating is it to go to some of those people that you worked with, Janet Malcolm, John Updike, and say, you know what, I found this mistake. You were wrong. Was that a daunting thing to do sometimes?
No, not at all. No, because the fact is that the best writers are always the most open to correction, to suggestion. And I mean, Updike was amazing. He was really one of the most professional writers I ever worked with, in the sense of he would consider any suggestion. He might not agree with you, but he would always consider everything in a serious way. And Janet Malcolm too. I mean, all the best writers, really. You weren't rewriting. I mean, it's not like you were rewriting their piece. You were just making some, suggestions that you could say would make a piece better.
Yes, which any writer would absolutely adore.
Well, no.
Yeah, that's true. The bad writers wouldn't adore it, but you had to be tactful. You didn't say, as you just said, Caro, you were wrong. You would not go right for the jugular like that. He'd say something a little more oblique, like, I had a thought about this sentence or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to talk about dictionaries because I think, Mary, I remember you telling me once that the Merriam-Webster was your favorite. I may have got that wrong, but I'm interested, which ones you use? Do you use multiple? Do you use real dictionaries? Do you use online dictionaries? How does that work?
Well, the Merriam-Webster's Little Red Web, the collegiate dictionary, now the 11th edition, I think, was the standard at the New Yorker. And I grew to love it. I visited the Merriam-Webster building in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I have the giant, the second edition. My hands are backwards, unabridged, as well as a third. But I also have a Funk and Wagnalls, a huge Funk and Wagnalls dictionary, and a big Random House. The easiest one to use is the Little Red Web, and it's just my favorite. I think because I'm so used to it, because the New Yorker used it. There are a lot of places that rip off the name Webster, but the Merriam-Webster is the one that actually bought Webster's work and has built on it ever since. Other dictionaries just I can't think of the names of them right now, but a lot of newspapers don't use Merriam-Webster. I don't think the Associated Press uses it. They have their own Websters.
Can I ask you, this may seem a ridiculous question, but I can't help but ask it because it's got into my head now. But you said that, what is an unabridged, what happens in an abridged version? Do they just shorten everything? Do they keep some words out? How does that work?
The funny thing is that there was the unabridged version, I think, came later, and the word unabridged was the term. The abridged dictionary, they don't call it the abridged dictionary, the little dictionary grew, and that became the unabridged dictionary. The Merriam-Webster's Little Red Web was not digested, was not abridged from the big one. It happened the other way around, that more words were put into the bigger dictionary. It's just the old second, Webster's second, there was a big fight in the States, in America, about Webster's third when it came out in the early 60s, I think it was. And the New Yorker came out in favor of the old version, very conservative. And the new one had swear words in it and things that were bad grammar, ain't. But the old one had that in it too. And somehow this just blew up. And the New Yorker continued to use Web 2 as its second source, second reference after the Little Red Web. But then I got very mixed up when I realized that new editions of the Collegiate were based on Webster's third, which, after all, did have such things in it as nuclear fission. It was just more, had more scientific words in it. And we were very snobbish, weren't we, Anne? We would say, well, Web 3 is good for science. And look things up in it.
Yeah, exactly.
How much was your budget at the New Yorker for dictionaries, I wonder?
We used to each have our own. We all were presented. When I went to the copy desk, I was presented with my own copy of the Collegiate Dictionary with my name written on the back inside cover, and I believe the date.
Yeah.
It was a very formal thing.
Yeah. I think mine might even be here. One of them. Anyway.
But then a lot of copy editors now do just use the online dictionary. And frankly, when I am at my computer and I can't remember how to spell a word, of course, I just type it into that bar and Webster's comes up and I look at it that way. I confess.
Have you got yours there, Mary Ann?
It's not my original one, but that's what it looks like. Well, actually, I should take the cover off.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And you began, let's turn a little to Ferrante now. You began translating Elena in 2004 after you won a contest for the Days of Abandonment. How did that come about? Was that a Europa idea? Or?
Yes, it came about because the parent company of Europa, Edizione AO in Rome, decided to start publishing books in English and open an sort of an English language publishing branch of their Italian company. And they'd always done a lot of translations. It was a few years after 9/11. They thought that there was a need for more global stuff, more global books. And the first book, they had published Ferrante in Italy, and so they decided that their first book would be Days of Abandonment. And they asked about 5 people to do sample translations. And that was the contest I won. So that was how it came about. I didn't know, I had never read Ferrante before that.
And is it correct that the now publisher, our beloved friend Michael Reynolds, was also in that competition? He didn't get the gig as a translator; he became the publisher.
But he told the story the other day and said that there was also an editing test. There was both a translating test and an editing test, and he did win the editing test. So good. He was hired as the editor.
Well, they're very lucky. They made 2 very good choices. So obviously the Neapolitan Quartet has just sold, it's become a worldwide phenomenon. It's sold more than 10 million copies, I think, in 40 countries, something like that. But all the while, Elena Ferrante has been able to remain anonymous. She's fiercely guarded her anonymity. And I want to talk to you both about being invisible, because copywriters and translators are usually in the background, and usually the invisible heroes of their writers, as we were talking about before. And yet Elena's anonymity has pushed you into the spotlight, Mary. Has pushed you into the spotlight, Anne. And Mary, you've come into the spotlight because you've written about your work as a person in the copy room. So I'm interested about this movement that you've had from being, in the background to now in the forefront.
Well, maybe we should talk about copy editing first, since it's the lesser of the arts. But it is true that a copy editor is a sieve, and you don't want to attract any attention. If you have any shred of ego, you would like somebody to notice that you did something right, but they only notice when you do something wrong. And I'd always been a writer. I had to pay the rent, so I was a copy editor, and that was a good fit for me because I loved language, but I wanted to write and had not a lot of luck getting published. And then the New Yorker website started, and they asked me if I would write about commas, because a writer in the New York Times had insulted the New Yorker for its comma style, its over fussy use of commas. And at first I didn't think it would be interesting at all to write about commas. I thought that would be boring. But I was the writer in the department. I'd been doing it for 30 years, copy editing. I knew about commas, or I should know something about commas. So I wrote this piece called In Defense of Nutty Commas. And that's when, a few more pieces about New Yorker style, I realized that there was possibly a market for a book about this. But it still surprised me, and I always felt a little like I was letting people in on a state secret. And kind of betraying the profession. But people wanted to know these things, and it turned out to be educational for people. And I also saved Anne the trouble of having to explain why the New Yorker used the diaresis.
I was going to say.
You did me such a great favor.
So it was a little hard, and I really especially did not like doing videos because I had to find example sentences that showed usage, and the sentences Anne also said, you can't use our mistakes. I was not supposed to, if a mistake ran in the New Yorker, my job was to shut up.
Right.
So I had to find sort of dull sentences, and they couldn't have political or sexual content. So it was hard to find examples for those videos, but I managed it and was glad when I didn't have to do them anymore.
But they were very popular.
Hugely popular. Didn't somebody describe New Yorker commas as something about knives being thrown at a body, as precisely as knives being thrown? You will be able to say that quote better than I do.
Well, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but it was E.B. White who said there's something like commas appear in the New Yorker with the precision of knives thrown around a figure by a circus guy, something like that.
Yes, that was.
Whenever there was a reason to put the comma in, we put the comma in. But we also, nobody gives us credit for that. We take commas out just as often as we put commas in. Nobody believes
we
it.
We move them around.
We do. We should. That's the comma shaker was the big joke that, we had this little tin can that one of the great old copy editors had perforated top, and she'd wrapped brown paper around it and drawn commas on it. And it was like something you'd had in a pizza parlor. And the joke was that just before the piece went to press, you'd sprinkle on the commas. And then shove it into the printing press. I blew the anonymity of the New Yorker's copies desk.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did a little bit. Did anybody push back?
I don't think so. I think when one of the first things I did was an interview with a literary agent who just wanted to know what it was like to be on the editorial staff, the copy editors, the copy desk of the New Yorker. And when I described the system of readers that we had, a piece can get read by 16 pairs of eyes before it goes to press. A while after that, instead of being all full of admiration for our system, some people were appalled that we lavished that much attention on things, but we couldn't help ourselves.
Yeah.
It's such a joy to read the New Yorker. There's never a mistake. It's always just the highest quality. It's a joy. And speaking of reading and joyousness, Anne, I'm wondering, would you give us a little reading of the new Ferrante?
So I'm just going to read a short section at the end of the first part. I don't think there's any spoiler in here. But the narrator is Giovanna, who's a 12-year-old girl. She lives with her parents are school teachers. She lives in a middle-class neighborhood of Naples. But her father is from a working-class neighborhood. And he's taking Giovanna to visit her aunt, his sister, Vittoria, who in the family has always been seen as kind of a spiteful, ugly figure. So this is from there. Whoops, I can't read it. After days of rain, Sunday was beautiful, with a blue sky and occasional little white clouds. My father made an effort to return to our light-hearted relationship, but when he started the car, he became silent. He hated the ring road and got off it quickly. He said he preferred the old streets, and as we made our way into another city, made up of rows of small, bleak apartment buildings, faded walls, industrial warehouses and sheds, gashes of green overflowing with garbage of every sort, deep puddles filled by the recent rain, putrid air, he became increasingly somber. But then he seemed to decide that he couldn't leave me in silence, as if he had forgotten about me, and for the first time mentioned his origins. I was born and grew up in this neighborhood here, he said, with a broad gesture that embraced, beyond the windshield, walls of tufa, gray, yellow, and pink apartment buildings. My family was poor. We didn't even have 2 cents to rub together. Then he drove into an even bleaker neighborhood, stopped, sighed with irritation, pointed to a brick building whose facade was missing large patches of plaster. Here's where I lived, he said, and where Aunt Vittoria still lives. I looked at him, frightened. He noticed. What's wrong? Don't go. I won't move. What if she keeps me? When you're tired, you'll say, I have to go now. What if she doesn't let me go? I'll come and get you. No, don't. I'll come. All right. I got out of the car, went through the entrance. There was a strong odor of garbage mixed with the aroma of Sunday sauces. I didn't see an elevator. I climbed up uneven, broken steps beside walls showing broad white wounds, one so deep it seemed like a hole dug out to hide something. I avoided deciphering obscene sayings and drawings. I had other urgencies. My father had been a child and a boy in this building. I counted the floors. On the third I stopped. There were 3 doors. The one on my right was the only one that displayed a surname, and pasted to the wood was a strip of paper on which was written in pen, Trada. I rang the bell, held my breath. Nothing. I counted slowly to 40. My father had told me some years earlier that whenever you're in a state of uncertainty, you should do that. When I got to 41, I rang again. The second electrical charge seemed exaggeratedly loud. A shout in dialect reached me, an explosion of hoarse sounds, and God damn it, what's the hurry, I'm coming. Then decisive steps, a key that turned 4 times in the lock. The door opened. A woman dressed all in blue appeared, tall, with a great mass of very black hair arranged on her neck, as thin as a post, and yet with broad shoulders and a large chest. She held a lighted cigarette between her fingers. She coughed and said, moving back and forth between Italian and dialect, What's the matter? You're sick? You have to pee? No. So why do you ring twice? I murmured, I'm Giovanna, Aunt. I know you're Giovanna, but if you call me Aunt again, you'd better turn right around and get out of here. I nodded yes. I was frightened. I looked for a few seconds at her face, without makeup, then stared at the floor. Vittoria seemed to me to have a beauty so unbearable that to consider her ugly became a necessity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful reading, Anne. And so Giovanna is a young Italian girl, and there's this movement between her life and her aunt's life, between a middle class and down to the depths, and there's that flow of the actual physicality of that in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could just mention that it's a different Naples from the Naples that we're familiar with in the Neapolitan Quartet, which is a very poor neighborhood of Naples. And this is a middle-class neighborhood. It's on a hill. It's literally on a hill. I mean, in real Naples, it's not just a metaphor. It's higher up. And Giovanna discovers that her father is from this lower part of Naples, and she becomes very interested in exploring it. And I think through her eyes, we discover her going. She talks about going down and down and down, literally, to go to this other part of Naples, and we, with her, discover what this other Naples is like. I mean, both physically and in terms of the people who live there, in terms of the language. It's another world, really.
I'm really interested in the teenage voice, because I think that Ferrante has captured that teenage voice, that those dilemmas of a teenager, the feelings of a teenager. How was that to translate? How did you get that tone, maintain that tone throughout?
I never know how to answer that question. I mean, I like to say that I'm just doing what Ferrante directed me to do in a certain sense. No, I mean, it was hard for me to be in the character of a teenager a little bit. It's not a time of one's life that you really want to go back to, but Ferrante really goes into it in as you say, quite a deep way and kind of a harsh way, really, because she really brings out all the conflicts, especially for girls. I mean, I just say especially for girls because I'm a girl, but for all teenagers, I think, have a lot of these kinds of conflicts and difficulties and questions. And I mean, it's a time when you really learn, you become disenchanted. You find out about the lying life of adults and of yourself in a way. So it's so she really, I think that, to say how to capture that, I mean, I think Ferrante captures it. And I feel that if I stay with her words and her sentences, that's going to come through.
And I just want to ask you about, I know that you've translated lots of people who are no longer with us, so you didn't have the opportunity to talk to them, but you could, I think, have the opportunity to talk to Ferrante, but you have chosen not to. You still go through her editor, her Italian editor. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I started out that way. She was much more reclusive when she started out than she is now. I mean, she's not a public figure, but she certainly gives a lot of interviews, and she gives quite generous interviews. I mean, she's a lot to say, but still, I started out by going through the editors when I had questions for her, and so I just continued that. And it seems comfortable for me, and I assume it's comfortable for her.
I recently interviewed Hilary Mantel's favorite translator, Ina Willems, who translates English into Dutch. And she said that one of the hardest things about translating, she's fantastic, she's so interesting, and she said that one of the hardest things about translating the Cromwell books, Hilary Mantel's Cromwell books, was the various titles, the lords and the ladies and the sirs, and also the trades. And I'm wondering, firstly, Mary, to ask you if that's the same in Greek. Are there, titles and trades that don't translate? And then after we hear from Mary, and for you to talk about it too in terms of the Italian and Ferrante.
Well, in Greek, the only thing that occurs to me in modern Greek is Kyrie, Kyrios, is the word for Mr. Kyria is the word for Mrs. Vespina is the word for Miss. But Kyrios is also the word for Lord, God. And I think that's true also in Italian, isn't it? Il Signore is also God, not just Mr.
Signore.
Yeah.
Right.
Take it, Anne.
Well, I'm just going to ask you a quick question. So if you were translating a book from Greek, would you say Mr. and Mrs., or would you use the Greek titles, for example?
I would be very tempted to use Kyrie and Kyrios because it's obvious what they mean, and it would give a little flavor of Greek to the English.
Right. Because I've always done, I mean, that's what I've done. I try to use Signora and Signore instead of Mr. and Mrs. I think it's somewhat, I think translators in general these days tend more to what I recently learned is called foreignization, which is to use words in the language from which they're translating, as Mary says, because it reminds you that you're actually in another culture, in another language. And because I think to call people Mr. and Mrs., I don't know, it has a sort of an odd ring to me when you call them Mr. I don't know, and like remember in our Italian books it says things like Mr. Rossi. Hello, Mr. Rossi. Buongiorno, Signor Rossi. It just
right. That makes him into an Italian American right away.
Exactly.
Right?
So yes, I've tended to use titles to keep Italian titles, but titles are a problem because you can't always do that. Like high school teachers are called professore, so you don't really want to call the high school teacher a professor. So it's
No.
you have to find ways to get around that. So there's always difficulties like that.
And what's the complication of dialect in the Ferrante novels? Because there are numerous dialects, and the Italians can't understand the Neapolitan dialect or any others. And so, how do you capture that and make that into meaningful? Show the difference, but also make it understandable.
Ferrante doesn't actually write in dialect very much. She uses dialect words. She sometimes will use a little bit of dialect in a sentence, but she, luckily she doesn't write a lot in dialect because I know a little bit of Neapolitan, but not very much. So when she says, so-and-so said in dialect, she's writing in Italian. A lot of times it's conversation, so it's a kind of more colloquial writing anyway. It's sort of quicker or shorter or more like conversation. So it's possible. This is what my theory is, that if I'm more conversational in the translation, like a little more colloquial, a little more slangy, that conveys the sense of dialect. Because otherwise, there are writers who write in dialect. Pasolini famously wrote in, his own version of Roman dialect. And if you try to translate it into some kind of American, I'm speaking of American, not Australian or Australian or British accent, it just sounds very artificial. So there's really not an answer about dialect.
Is there an equivalent, Mary? Is there an equivalent that you can think of in Greek?
Well, every place in Greece has its own dialect. In the islands, in the island of Rhodes, they speak with the dialect of Rhodes. I've been in, actually, there are a lot of Greek temples in Sicily, so I have been to Sicily. And when somebody up in the mountains in Sicily when you address someone who just pops out of a doorway, they speak not, it's certainly not Italian. I guess it's Sicilian, and you just don't know quite what it is. But I don't, yeah, there is not, well, there are all kinds of levels in Greek, because, of course, there was ancient Greek, and for a long time, just until sometime in the 1970s, in fact, there was an official language called Katharevousa, which was a purified version of what the people spoke, called Dimotiki, and that was used for all government publications and also in newspapers. And it was only in around like the mid 70s, just before I started studying Greek, that they made the people's language the official language of Greece. Before, and the Katharevousa was very artificial. Poets used it. The idea was to have more echo of the ancient language in modern writing, but nobody spoke it. And it was probably kind of like the way that Dante introduced Italian into literature by writing in Italian and not in Latin, that modern Greek writers started using the Demotic language, the way people speak, to write novels. Kazantzakis is who I'm thinking of offhand. And then it became okay. There are a lot of different levels still going on, though, in Greek.
Now, I know we're coming to the end of our time. It's gone so fast, but we took some questions from the audience, and so I have a question from Alira, who says, "What advice do you have for young women with the desire to become a literary translator?"
have a day job, first of all. You can't really make a living as a translator, as a literary translator. You can actually make a living as other kinds of translator, but I mean, I think that my advice would be to do it. There are actually, I don't know if this is true in Australia, but in America now there are a lot of there are like master's programs in literary translation. There are courses. So it's becoming something that people can study. So it's being taken more seriously as a kind of academic discipline. So that's one route. Another route is just to do it. There are a lot of online publications where you can submit translations and try to get them published. Asymptote, Words Without Borders are the two biggest ones, I think, probably. There are a lot of small publishing houses now, at least in America, that publish translations. So there's, the world of translation is kind of opening up a little bit.
So when I was in America and working, when I first met you, Anne, and was working on the Penn World Voices Festival with Salman Rushdie, which was a festival all about translation, and was our job to bring Salman thought that after 9/11, America had really closed itself down, was looking more and more inward. And he said, so if we can't make America read the world, we'll bring the world to America. And that was the beginning of that festival, which I was lucky enough to work with him on. And then at that point, the figures for translation were something around about 3% of books published in America were from translation. I'm wondering, has that 3% moved anything? Has it moved at all? Has the dial moved?
That it hasn't. I mean, it seems as if it must have, because there's certainly more attention is paid to translations. But I don't know, the last thing I saw was that I think that in fact, it hadn't really changed. It was still at that ridiculous 3%. So no, I don't know that it's changed very much.
Do you think that you've both played a role in helping people understand this beauty of taking words from one language to another in your work?
I mean, of course, one can only always hope that. I mean, I guess I've been lucky in the fact that that the Neapolitan novels, Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, have been incredibly popular, and she is an absent author, and therefore, as for people, somehow people want to have a figure to attach to the books. So that was me. And I think it's brought some attention to the fact that that translators exist. So, I guess I can hope that that's the case.
And Mary, that the quote earlier that I quoted about from the Washington Post about that your work was porn for word nerds. What I love about your work is that it made, I don't know what I am exactly, but I care deeply about words, obviously, but I was never a grammarian until I read and I was astounded that I could be reading about, I don't know what some of the terms, I don't even know the grammatical terms, but I was so fascinated. And so it was just such a joy to read that and to understand. And then in the book about Greece and Greek and all those, the roots of so much of our language is based in Greek. And it just seemed to open up worlds. And I think when you understand about that translation and how language has evolved and developed and changes from one to the other is just beautiful.
Well, I hope that with the Greek book, I persuaded some people that they didn't need to be intimidated by Greek. It's a different alphabet, but you learned one alphabet when you were 4 years old or maybe even earlier, and it's not that hard to learn another alphabet. And Anne really has brought translation from the Italian to a lot of people, and good translation. I am somebody who's a little bit of a snob in that I always like to think that I would like to read the writer in the original. But, there's a lot of writers I'm not going to read ever if I don't settle for a translation. So it's wonderful to have a translation that is the best possible translation.
So I have another question from Lorna. She says, I teach editing and I find that many of my students really struggle with walking that fine line between correcting errors of punctuation and grammar and editing for comprehension and rewriting the author's words so that it sounds right to them, often killing the author's voice in the process. Is there an analogy, an anecdote, or a quick tip you could suggest that would help me explain the difference to them?
Go ahead. You're my explainer.
Thing just about overcoming your ego, remembering that it's not your name on the piece and that your job is not to rewrite. Your job is to make that writer sound the best that he or she can sound, and to keep it minimal.
Yeah. Going back to the spelling test question, when I gave we had a test of when people applied to be copy editors or proofreaders at the New Yorker, we have a copy editing test. And one of the most capital letter instructions is don't rewrite. So maybe you just say don't rewrite, fix the punctuation, but don't rewrite.
And you have to forget about what you learned in 5th grade. People are so attached to things they learned from their 3rd grade teacher.
Oh, yeah.
Say that they just can, and New Yorker style was different. So you have to remember who you're copy editing for, too.
It's very funny because after being 11 years in the United States and spelling without a U everywhere and a Z instead of an S and the full stop goes inside the inverted commas, I've had to change everything back, and it's a very strange process. I was reluctant to go into American English. And I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but I've started now, so I have to go through with it. And I've been reluctant to go back. it took me actually 3 years, and it was only when I got this job at the Wheeler Centre that I thought I actually have to change my spelling on my computer to Australian spelling. And it really does. I feel it changes the words, and also I think that punctuation of having the full stop next to the last letter of the thing before the inverted commas looks better than it being the full stop being out in the middle of nowhere.
You're correct. It does.
And this also raises the question that Anna and I have talked about before. You can tell when a British translator has done something on an Italian work. You translate into American English or British English. There's a big difference.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What's the difference?
You can hear the accent.
The spelling, obviously.
But it's the spelling. You can hear the accent in the spelling.
Yeah. But also they're just vocabulary words that we use different words for things. What's the boot and the hood, or the boot and, I forget. Is the boot the hood or the back of the car?
The trunk. The trunk and yeah.
I mean, things like that.
Yeah, the carrier bag and the lift.
Yeah, right.
There's so many. Anyway, look, it's been an absolute joy to talk with you both. I could speak to you for hours. It's lovely to see you both. Thank you both for taking time to come and talk to us in Australia. And congratulations on the new book, Anne, and congratulations to Europa and its text, and it's Alan and Unwin here. And Mary's book is also available through text here. And again, I'd encourage everybody to go to neighbourhoodbooks.com and buy the books. It's been a delight to talk to you both. Thank you so much for joining the Wheeler Centre.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.